Thank you very much. Thank you, Randy, Clyde. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It is really great being back at Mizzou. I actually graduated from here in 2003 and had a really strange moment of deja vu the other day. So flashback to my freshman year of college, and it was midterms week and the week before midterms week, and I had a friend's birthday party at home. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go home. And like any true son or daughter, I'm gonna bring my books and my notes with me, and I'm gonna study this weekend. And I'm gonna pack everything and throw it all in a laundry basket, throw my dirty laundry on top of that, on top of my books, and I'm gonna hit the books hard this weekend. And then after an entire weekend of hanging out with friends, I'm sitting there in my room and I realize, oh my gosh, I have to drive down I-70 for a moment of truth at Mizzou, and here are my books with my folded laundry. My mother, she was an angel, and she did my laundry for me. And there's those books that I didn't touch all weekend. I think, okay, I've got a lot of work. So 19 years later, I'm sitting in my childhood bedroom preparing notes for this discussion, and I just felt like I had been there before. I don't know if anybody in here can relate to that feeling of eager anticipation for coming to Mizzou to give deliver something or take a test. So just out of curiosity, so I see a little bit of older faces in here. How many people are faculty here? Okay, great. How many undergraduate students do we have? Oh, good, great. Graduate students? Okay, one graduate student, good. Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. It's funny, and when we say that in the military, usually that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, because when we say thank you for being here, they have to be there. So you don't have to be here today, and I'm really grateful for that. So another show of hands, how many people are in journalism, in the journalism field? Okay, everybody in here. Any non-journalism folks? Okay. What's your background? Communication, political science?
I'm with Boone County Historical Society.
Oh, okay. Great.
He's the one who got me into it.
Oh, great.
Information technology.
Information technology. Okay, fantastic. Well, one of the reasons why I asked that question, actually one more question. How many people have a Twitter account in here? Okay, most everybody. I kind of figured that. Okay, so the reason why I asked that question is because I want you to take 3 things away from this today. So if you take nothing out of this discussion today, I want you to walk away with having learned 3 things. And most of you probably already know this and understand this, and hopefully I'll just build upon what you already know. So the first thing is that social media is an effective tool for spreading disinformation. And when I started my project, I think that people kind of understood that, but now it's definitely in the public attention. People really understand that social media is an effective tool for spreading disinformation. The second thing is that if you want to study this issue, you can't just focus on the technology piece. You can't just focus on the national security piece, which is actually my third point. It requires interdisciplinary understanding. And of course, my third piece is that information warfare is a national security issue. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you are here today because of, as Clyde mentioned, I wrote an article for Strategic Studies Quarterly, which is an Air Force publication. It was based on a thesis that I wrote for an Air Force school. And an important caveat for today is that even though I'm presenting this, and I am a lieutenant colonel, and even though this was published in an Air Force publication, this is not the opinion of the United States government, the United States Department of Defense, or the United States Air Force. This was all based on my academic research. But Rudy Keller from the Columbia Tribune came upon my article and noticed that I had a particularly interesting piece for the region, and that is I had noticed a connection between Russian troll accounts and the protests here at Mizzou back in 2015. And I'd like to start my presentation with that, because that really was the genesis of all of my research. That was how I began my thesis. So what I'd like to do is tell the story for how I came upon this, talk a little bit about the academic work that I did and how I conducted my research. And I'll do that for about 45 minutes, and then I'll try to leave plenty of time for questions if you have any at the end. So I was sitting in Washington, D.C. I was a fellow at Georgetown University at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. And my research topic was, why is ISIS so good at Twitter? And the United States government seemed to be really quite inept at Twitter. I was also working at the State Department at the time. It was part of an Air Force fellowship that I did. And one of the things that I very quickly noticed was that one of the things that ISIS did really, really well was they used an American narrative to insert their own narrative. They weren't trying to create propaganda. They weren't trying to create a narrative. They were using our own narrative against us. Now, I'm sitting there on one night in November, and the protests at Mizzou had been going on for a little while, and they'd been gaining national attention. And I'm obviously interested in this. I'm concerned by this because I went to Mizzou. This is a place that I regard as a home. And I was concerned because one night there were all kinds of social media activities saying that the Ku Klux Klan was on campus and that they were threatening people, and that this was a situation that was turning really bad really quickly. And I'm watching this, and the hashtag Pray for Mizzou started to trend nationwide. And I'm simultaneously watching news broadcasts and looking at my Twitter feed, and I'm just getting more and more and more angry because I didn't want to believe that it was happening. I didn't want to believe that all of this was happening where I came from. And it turns out that all of these things seem to be not true. And you see here some of the images that I saw. These were actually images that were used in some of the tweets. And one of the tweets said what you see up there on the board: "The cops are marching with the KKK. They beat up my little brother. Watch out. Hashtag pray for Mizzou." Now, as I understand it, the hashtag Pray for Mizzou was actually started by a student on campus who actually wanted to start a prayer group to pray for the protesters and to pray for the situation on campus for reconciliation. But what was happening that night on Twitter, as this trend continued to rise and stayed as the #1 trend in the United States, is that it was hijacked by messages like this. And if you know anything about social media, you know that it feeds on emotion. You get emotional when you look at social media. Studies have been done that show that people's blood pressure rises, their heart rate rises when they're looking at social media. And my heart rate was definitely elevated that night. So what I did was I actually confronted one of the people. It was a profile account named Jermaine, had an African-American male picture on there, and he kept tweeting things out like this about how the KKK was beating up his little brother, and used that picture there. And I thought, this doesn't seem right. There's something wrong about this. So what I did was, this was before Google image search, before you could actually search using an image, but I just Googled bruised black boy. And that's what I came up with, this African-American child who had been beat up 2 years prior. So I started looking up these other images that I found. And sure enough, the first time I Googled police and KKK, that image popped up. People were using images off of Google Images and inserting them into tweets and making it seem like this was happening in Colombia. Now, I had a friend who is in the Air Force, and she's African American, and her daughter was attending the University of Missouri at the time, and I called her, and I said, "Hey, how is Jasmine doing right now?" And she said that she's holed up with a group of black students, terrified to go outside because they're afraid of this. And at that moment, I was just furious that somebody that I knew at a place that I loved was subjected to this, and it wasn't real. So I actually tweeted at this person, and I said, "Stop lying. This isn't true." And he came back, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said something along the lines of, "Well, it is true, this is true, and the media is not covering it." Really important point right there. The media is not covering it. That was one of the biggest themes of this hashtag, was that the media wasn't covering what was going on here, that there was a level of scandal there, that all of this was happening and it wasn't being broadcast. So again, you have a layer of fear and intimidation, and a layer of lack of distrust in institutions that was being spread by this. So as I'm continuing to watch all of these tweets happen, I realize that none of this is real, but I kind of forget about it for a little while. A few months later, I'm continuing my research on ISIS social media, and I came across an article that I ended up using in my paper and it was by Adrian Chin. It was completely unrelated to ISIS, but it did talk about social media and utilizing social media as a weapon. And this was called the Agency, and that picture that you see there is of the old building that was used in the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. It was a troll farm. And in 2014, on September 11th, this troll farm started to tweet about a chemical explosion plant at the Columbia Chemicals Company in Centerville, Louisiana. Interestingly enough, a couple years prior, there was actually a chemical plant explosion in Louisiana. That was real news. This was not. At that time, the people that lived in and around that chemical plant actually got targeted text messages to their phones that said, "There's been a chemical plant explosion nearby, take your family and run." There was also an internet hoax, social media hoax, that included tweets to journalists saying, again, "Why aren't you covering this?" And this was one of the images that was tweeted out. This is not the CNN homepage, but it looks a lot like the CNN homepage. This was completely fabricated, and all of this was fake. The chemical plant hadn't exploded. There was no need to panic, but it was on September 11th. So the other narrative that came from that was, this was a terror attack. And why isn't the United States doing anything about this terrorist attack? Why is ISIS not getting bombed right now because of this? The United States government is weak. The United States government is inept for letting this happen. And the journalists are just sweeping it under the rug. And when I read that, I realized that these perpetrators at the Internet Research Agency in Russia had just gotten a free terrorist attack. And that's exactly what ISIS was doing. With dedicating zero resources in terms of dollars or people or training, they could take an internet hoax and turn it into a terrorist attack. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But after I finished my fellowship in Washington, D.C., I moved to Alabama, to Montgomery, Alabama. I attended the School for Air and Space Studies, which is School for Advanced Air and Space Studies, which is a master's degree granting program for the Air Force. That's where I wrote my thesis. And it's kind of a funny story how I ended up writing my thesis. That was not my original thesis topic. But what happened was the 2016 election. So I noticed once I pulled up this article and started learning about these techniques that the IRA was using, I went back and looked at my handwritten notes. It's just things that I had scribbled down from that night back in November 2015 from the Pray for Mizzou protests. And what I noticed was that all of these people that were supposedly African-American students who were concerned about what was happening here on campus had changed. And most of them were tweeting in German. To include the one person who I tweeted at. All of a sudden, this Germain had turned into a German nationalist who was concerned about immigration, Syrian immigrants, Syrian refugees in Germany. And the narrative that they were trying to spread was that the German government was inept, the German government was corrupt, trying to bring down the German people, and that these refugees were doing nothing but running around, committing crimes, murdering people, killing people, robbing people, and trying to create fear and chaos in Germany. A few months later, same group of people, now tweeting in German and English and talking about what was going on in Syria. Again, the theme is the exact same thing. It's anti-European Union, anti-United States, anti-institution. And that was when I realized, okay, there's a theme going on here. And what I realized when I was doing my ISIS research was the same thing that I used when I started doing my Russia research, which is you have to follow the network. So if you're interested in doing some of the research like what I did here, I would advise you not to seek out individual troll accounts. I would also advise you not to engage with individual troll accounts. It's really not worth it. But what you can do is you can kind of get a pulse for what the network is talking about. You can get a sense for how the network is moving. And I noticed that this network, you could almost visualize how it was moving from topic to topic to topic together. It was coordinated. It was synchronized. One of the things that the network was pushing out when they were talking about the German refugees was the fact that there was an ethnic Russian girl in Russia, or in Germany, who was raped by one of these refugees. It turns out that story was a complete fabrication. But the Russian foreign minister and RT, Russia Today, was pushing out this propaganda that the German government was hiding something. It didn't happen. But from there, you could see that the entire network was moving in lockstep with exactly the same messaging that the Russian government was putting out. And as I'm observing this, it kind of became a side hobby for me. It was just fascinating to keep up with these trolls. And every day I was just kind of adding on to my notes and following more and more of this, how this network was moving. So in one of my classes, it was a technology and development for military strategy class at the SAS University. And I wrote a paper that I took my ISIS research, and I took what I had learned from Russia and how they had tended to target pro-Trump voters in the 2016 election. I compiled it together, and I wrote 20 pages for this class, and I turned it in, and I thought, this is the best paper that I have ever written. This is fantastic. And he gave me a B-. And the reason why he gave me a B- was because the question was, is technology changing the nature of warfare? And I, at first, thought about it, and I thought about Clausewitz. And I thought, what would Clausewitz say about this? And I think that he would say, no, the nature of warfare is static. The nature of warfare will never change, right? So what he told me when he gave me that B- was, the reason why I gave you a B- had nothing to do with your research. I thought it was great. It had nothing to do with your writing. I thought it was fine. But I took the easy way out. And I said, no, this doesn't change the nature of warfare at all. He said, if what you said is true, this changes everything. And he also encouraged me to change my thesis topic to start writing about this, to take my side project and actually do academic research on it, and that's exactly what I did. He also encouraged me to find a parallel in history. Where has this happened before? And what I discovered was, sure enough, there was a person who is an air power enthusiast. And if I'm attending an air power school, by golly, I probably ought to write about an air power theorist. This is Giulio Douhet. And he lived around the time period of World War I. He was in the Italian Air Force. And he was a general. And he observed trench warfare in World War I. And I'm sure that all of you understand that trench warfare was very static. There was not a whole lot of ground movements. There weren't big naval battles or anything like that. This was not Napoleonic warfare. The machine gun had changed everything. Because now you couldn't perform Napoleonic movements, troop movements, right? And the bullet stopping power of dirt was highly effective in World War I. So everybody was dug into the trench, and Douhet said, hey, there's something new. There's a new piece of technology that is going to make this trench warfare a thing of the past. In fact, in his mind, warfare as we knew it was going to be a thing of the past. And that invention was the airplane. And what he believed was, with the airplane, you could take this airplane, overfly the trenches. You don't even need an army. You don't need a navy. What you need to do is bomb the people. Bomb the civilians. And if you kill the civilians and you take away their livelihood, if you take away their jobs, what are they going to do? They're going to go to their government and they're going to say, hey, we want change. We don't want this war. So make terms with these people right now because we don't want to fight anymore. And what he said was, there will be no place where life or work can go on in comparative safety and tranquility. Life would never be the same. And also, if you know about World War I, if you've ever read the book Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, really fantastic book. And at the very beginning, it talked about the patriotic nature of warfare. Every country that was going to war in World War I, they went to war in August, and they thought they would be home by Christmas. They thought that they were doing their service to God and country, and this was the right thing to do, this was the patriotic thing to do, and they were going to do things in a glorious way. War would be glorious. In his mind, war is no longer going to be glorious people are no longer going to want to do this, want to fight this war. So was he right? Well, we had an opportunity to test his theory in World War II, and this is from the Tube in London during the Battle of Britain when the Germans tried to bomb London. Did it work? No. The English people went underground, they sat out the bombings. The next morning they woke up, they cleared the rubble, had a cup of tea, and cheered on the patriotic effort, right? So it didn't happen exactly the way that Duhay expected. But like a lot of military theorists, they're not exactly right in the next war, but often they're vindicated in the following war. And the war following World War II was the Cold War. And his belief was the narrative of air power would keep people from wanting to fight. With the advent of nuclear weapons, that tended to happen. No longer was great power conflict seen as even remotely possible. Because of nuclear weapons, or atomic weapons at that time, nobody wanted to fight the Soviets. It wasn't going to happen because of the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons. So where am I going with this? Duhay was talking about the narrative. And in Washington, D.C., in policy circles in 2015, that was all the topic. That was the topic du jour. That's what everybody was talking about. How do we change the narrative? How do we change the focus of these people that are interested in ISIS on social media? How do we change the narrative? How do we change the narrative? Well, one of the problems with changing the narrative is that it's extremely difficult to do because the narrative is a collection of public opinions. And public opinion always starts with the individual. And people's opinion is not something that develops overnight. It's something that develops over time. So here you have a temporal scale that shows from past, that shows your cultural values. Those values are influenced and held by your parents. And the double lines here represent stronger links. Those values are then internalized by the individual. The social characteristics of the parents, also critically important. Those social characteristics go towards showing how people identify with certain groups. And then those values become internalized by the individual. And when they are, that is based on a past. That is based on their entire life, the way they were raised, the culture they were raised in. So when you have media coverage of events, their perception of events are based on their past. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But with that, you have to understand that you can't just insert propaganda and make people change their mind. And this book was called True Believer. It was written by Eric Hoffer, who was a philosopher. He was born in Germany. He moved to the United States, and he was a longshoreman in San Francisco. And he was an observer of human nature. And one of the pieces that he noticed with human nature is that in order to change somebody's mind, in order to understand how people become part of mass movements, you have to understand human nature. And that was critically important to him. But he said propaganda on its own cannot force its way into unwilling minds. Fast forward to today. That same statement, I believe, remains true. You can't just force somebody to believe something. You can't just put a lot of information out there and expect somebody to believe something. However, my argument is that this time is now compressed, with social media specifically. Now, when I went to Mizzou in the early 2000s, we couldn't really interact with the internet. And I'm sure that most of you remember that. So unless you could design a web page or had a web page of your own or knew somebody that had a web page, you couldn't put things on the internet. You mostly just retrieved things from the internet. Well, in the mid to late 2000s, that changed. Around 2004, 2005, all of a sudden now you could start interacting with the internet. You could start producing content. Blogs became popular. Social media became popular. So now anybody with an opinion can put something online. Anybody with a camera on their phone can put somebody online. Anybody can now be a journalist. Anybody can cover the events that are going on around them. And if you look at those three circles that I have up there, those are three circles where social media can impact. Opinions expressed by peers, identification with groups, and media coverage of events. Now people can choose exactly what information they want to receive and how they receive it. So what this creates is a concept known in social networking terms called homophily, which is birds of a feather flock together, right? And what you see from this graph here, this is from the 2016 election, And this shows how Trump supporters and Clinton supporters were living essentially in their own little social bubbles. This large cluster of Trump supporters down here, they had little mutual follower overlap with other users, but they were a uniquely responsive and cohesive group. Whereas Clinton did not necessarily have that same cluster of individuals down here. Okay, so if that's the case, if people are just going to choose what they want to choose and listen to the groups that they want to listen to, and identify the groups that they want to identify with on social media, how does fake news become real news? If all of this information is in one place on somebody's Twitter feed or Facebook feed, if they're not going outside of their feed, how is this fake news ever going to spread? If you aren't a part of this cluster down here, and if you are not following these people, it doesn't matter how many bot accounts you have. You're never going to see that information, are you? Well, that's where I came up with this theory. So we'll come back to the ODNI report. The ODNI report was written by the Director of National Intelligence, which was really where I got a lot of my information on how the Russians conducted their social media activity. And it matched exactly what I was discovering and uncovering through my own research. And according to this, Kremlin bloggers prepared a Twitter campaign, #DemocracyRip, on election night in anticipation of Secretary Clinton's victory, judging from their social media activity. So what we'll do is a counterfactual experiment here. Let's say that Secretary Clinton would have won that night. You probably would have seen a large group of people who were celebrating that. They probably would have had a hashtag, something along the lines of Hillary won. Whereas this other bubble would have been talking about #DemocracyRip. Now, it could have definitely spread within this social circle, which would have been influenced by Russians, but without doubt included a lot of Americans. And the only way that's going to bridge the gap between these two networks is the trends function. So that's why I came up with the topic and the title for my paper, Command of the Trend. So Duhay, in his book, he called his book Command of the Air. I called my topic Command of the Trend. Because if you command the trend, now you can bridge that gap. Now you can cross networks. If you can cross networks, you can insert a narrative into the other side that they probably would not have seen in the first place. And I think that that's really important. We'll cover a little bit more of that in just a second. But how do you actually gain command of the trend? So there are three ways that I've identified that people do this. One is a marketing strategy. And you'll see that here. This is to use every trend in your message. So this was a couple years ago. This was during the NCAA tournament. You see Villanova, Wisconsin, Badgers, UFC London was apparently trending. Hayes, Hart, West Virginia, Notre Dame. My least favorite 4 words was trending. And this person decided to sell some merchandise with a resist t-shirt using all of the hashtags. So in other words, you find all of the trending hashtags, you add your hashtag to your message, every single trending hashtag, and hopefully that somebody clicks on that trend, they will see your message in their Twitter stream. Also worth noting here, I've already mentioned that the right network, the far right network, specifically Trump supporters in 2016, were heavily influenced by Russian social media. We all know that now. But this is an example of where networks on the left are being attacked as well. So it's not just a Republican problem. It's not just a Democrat problem. This is across the board. This is an issue that is going to be of concern to us for some time. The second way of doing that is to hijack a trend. So if you want to get command of the trend, you can hijack a trend. And there was no better group than ISIS in 2014, 2015 at hijacking trends, specifically during the World Cup in 2014. They hijacked this trend and they raised security levels in Brazil by creating false threats, hoaxes, and spreading of memes showing beheadings, decapitations, et cetera, et cetera. It created fear and panic for people who are watching the World Cup, for people that were attending the World Cup. All of a sudden, if you clicked on the hashtag World Cup 2014, which was a trend for quite some time during the World Cup, it seemed like about every third message or so you would see was ISIS propaganda. And with that, I'd like to take just a moment to talk about the power of images, because ISIS understood the power of images. They understood what this image means to people. And it means two different things to two different people. So if you are sympathetic with ISIS and their goals and their objectives, and you look at this picture, you see strength, you see power, you see a group of people who are winning, right? That's victory right there. If you are not an ISIS supporter, if you're living in the United States and you see this trending on Twitter, this is something to be afraid of. This is a group that's very, very powerful. This is a group that's caliphate is strong, and they're going to bring terror to where you are. What's fascinating about that is that even in the expanse of the caliphate that ISIS had, they were never really an extremely powerful international group. They did not plan international attacks. Their sole purpose was establishing a caliphate in the Middle East first, and then expanding out. And ultimately, they were a bit of a doomsday cult. They wanted a final battle against the Western powers that they never really got, but that was their objective. It was a bit of a doomsday cult. But the power of images, the power of one picture that means two different things to two different people, depending on your background, is prevalent when you're looking at social media content, specifically propaganda on social media. And I have a couple of examples here. So take a look at this picture. Absent any content whatsoever, you've already established in your mind what you think is happening here. Based on who you are, where you come from, your race, your life experiences, whether you have friends or family who are law enforcement officers, whether you're a journalist, notice the journalists down here taking pictures, based on your knowledge of what could have possibly happened based on your knowledge and understanding of the news. And this same picture can be used within far-right networks and far-left networks, and it could mean the exact same thing to both sides, that this picture could demonstrate something that really has the same meaning, but is interpreted different by different people. Here's another example. What does this mean? When you look at this, how do you feel about this, right? So a lot of people have some pretty strong feelings about this. Here's just another example. Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. What does that mean? Well, if you're not from New England, cheaters, maybe? But if you're from New England, these are the greatest two geniuses ever, and with the greatest athlete ever, right? Here's another example. Anybody familiar with the white helmets in Syria? This is an important example because this is one of the narratives that Russian social media pushes out frequently. That ISIS is embedded and Al-Qaeda is embedded in the white helmets. The white helmets are receiving funding from the Central Intelligence Agency, and it's all fake. Everything that you see from the white helmets is fake, according to them. But the white helmets, they're a rescue organization in Syria. All they do is they go around rescuing people after the Syrians have bombed civilians. Of course, to the Russians, they're trying to hide this. They're trying to say that this is propaganda because the Russians and the Syrians are allied in this fight against terrorism, which creates an interesting dynamic. And I titled this slide "The Truth Spectrum." And I call it that because if you take a little element of truth, you can walk that message off. So if you take a little element of truth that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are fighting against Assad, that's true. You can then move down the line and say that Russia and Assad are fighting terrorists. Okay, well, if they are fighting directly, encountering, attacking Al-Qaeda and ISIS, then yes, that is true. White helmets receive U.S. government funding. Okay, there may be an element of truth to that. But if that's the case, you can easily walk this message off into conspiracy territory, where now the United States is funding terrorists. This was one of the themes, specifically during the Obama administration with their actions in Syria. and the messaging that Russian Twitter was putting out there. Now, I'm an electronic warfare officer by trade, so you'll have to excuse me if this is a little bit too specific. But in electronic warfare, if I'm on an aircraft, say the B-52, a radar is tracking me, I can use a technique called a range gate pull-off. All right, so a radar works essentially like this. You receive all kinds of returns. So if this is amplitude of the return signal, this is range down here. Perhaps that's a mountain that's in the way of the radar that's getting a return. You have all kinds of atmospheric static and noise. If they get a radar return on me flying around in my B-52, it's going to generate a spike that looks like that. It is completely transparent to the radar operator. The computer is doing this for him. And what the computer will do, the radar will do, is it will cut out all of this noise. And it will create what's called a range gate right around me that says that this B-52 is a target at this many miles. And what they'll see on the radar scope is just a return of me. Well, what I can do is I can apply a lot of noise. What I want to do is I want to take this automatic noise level that is the computer cancels out, and I want to raise that threshold. So I provide more noise amplitude high enough to cover up my signal return. Then my jammers can take another signal that starts with some truth. I'm right here. I can then delay the timing of that return to show that I'm here, to show that I'm here, to show that I'm here. So every time that radar gets a return signal, it's showing me moving away from the radar, whereas in actuality, I could be moving towards the radar. Again, the way that I do that, I raise the noise level to the point where the truth is obscured. I then start with a true basis, a true starting point for where I actually am, and then I start pulling that range gate off. It's called a range gate pull-off. The exact same thing happens with social media. In fact, I call it a message gate pull-off. It's where you can start with just a little bit of truth, and using a logic train with just that little bit of truth, you can walk a message continually off the target. And you can convince people that something that is preposterous may actually be true. And it also uses something called an availability heuristic. Availability heuristic was defined by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And a heuristic is just a way of your brain making a shortcut. To make sense of processing a lot of information, your brain is going to take the easiest route to understand what it's processing. So for example, if you see a news report about a spike in kidnappings, you're probably going to start becoming a little bit more concerned. Well, I just saw this news report that said that there are a lot of kidnappings, so maybe I should be concerned with kidnappings. Because it's available. It's readily available in your mind because you just saw it, you just heard about it. And with social media, again, this time is compressed. This timeline is compressed with social media. So now, the opinions expressed by your peers may be the latest thing that you saw. And you're more likely to believe things from your peers than from other sources, especially on social media. It's a fascinating subject. But this availability heuristic, it creates the shortcut in your mind. So if you saw something, even if you don't believe it, it's there. You ever see those little ads at the bottom of a news article or something like that? You go to a website and you just see these really weird things that says, maybe it'll show a picture of a rotten banana or something that says, don't eat this food for your heart or something like that. And then you ever see a banana and think about that same article? Well, it's because your mind created an availability heuristic. It created a heuristic with that. It may make no sense. You don't necessarily believe that, but the next time you see that, you think about that. And that can change things. Now, all of a sudden, with this timeline being compressed for how somebody makes a decision, if you see something online, you may start to believe it. So these are three things that I've actually heard people say: intelligent, educated, well-read people. Some elements fighting Russia and Ukraine are Nazis. Rape went up in Germany because of Syrian refugees. The mainstream media does not report a lot of things that should be covered that I'm seeing on Twitter. These are three actual things that I've heard, again, intelligent, educated people say out loud, and they actually believe it. This is the narrative, the exact narrative that Russia is trying to push. They're trying to raise the noise level. They're trying to raise the noise level and start slowly walking truth off. And here's one example of that. This was, I found this in my research, this was on October 26th, I believe, 2016. 27th, 28th. This was a hashtag called Draft Our Daughters. And it started based on an article that Hillary Clinton gave, I believe it was an interview with MSNBC, and she said that she would support females registering for the draft. Fairly benign news topic. However, this trend started as a result of that, using fake imagery, using Hillary Clinton's actual campaign logo and styles to show exactly what was happening according to this narrative. And what you'll see here, and there were several images, I found hundreds of these images. A common thread involves Syria, down in the lower left-hand corner, involves Russia, it involves kind of racist images, sexist images, anti-Islamic images, but it all goes along with this theme. And the theme was that Hillary Clinton was trying to get people to register for the draft. Also that Hillary Clinton wanted to go to war in Syria, war with Russia. It was all propaganda. It was all a hoax. This trend trended for hours on Twitter. And it was the most incredible thing to me. But the third way that you get command of the trend is to create a trend. And that's exactly what happened there. Now, creating a trend is not the easiest thing to do. And in order to do it, you need a botnet. So there's a lot of confusion about exactly what a bot network is, what a bot is. A lot of people will call any troll or anybody they see online, oh, you're just a bot, you're just a bot. Well, a bot is actually it's an algorithm, it's a code. It says, if somebody tweets this, then I'm going to retweet it. Or if this topic comes up, I'm going to automatically respond to it with this pre-canned message. And there are three different types that I've identified, the three components that make up a bot network. There are automatic bots, there are semi-automatic bots, and there's an active human. An automatic bot does what I said earlier, where they just retweet. And you can see that. You can see an account that does nothing but retweet particular influential accounts. A semi-automatic, occasionally it seems like there's a human that's actually interacting there. And they're also very capable of changing the messaging as they go along. But they still do a lot of retweeting. They still pump out a lot of information that comes from one unique specific source. And then an active human actually has to control that network. So here's the active human. We're going to go back to the example from the counterfactual election night where he is tweeting democracy rip. If he has a bot network, he tweets democracy rip. That bot network then starts to retweet it. Now, imagine that there are several different bot networks. Now, maybe these people are influential. Maybe this is an American. Maybe this American has his own bot network. Maybe this is a foreign adversary. Maybe this is a Russian, the IRA. Hard to say. This is just for demonstration purpose. But if they start tweeting democracy rip, they start tweeting democracy rip, it keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going. Maybe I had too many builds. But you get the idea. This message is growing and growing and growing until that trends. They've just created a trend. And what this tends to do is what I call the Betty White effect. Anytime Betty White is trending on Twitter, people go crazy. Because what's happening with Betty White? Is Betty White still alive? What's happening? In fact, I bet that if all of you pulled out your phone right now and tweeted Betty White for just a few tweets, eventually people would start noticing that. And eventually it would build a trend here in Colombia, and then possibly in the United States as people start talking about that. So people interact with that trend. So if you look at these people who may have been tweeting Hillary won on election night, now all of a sudden they're tweeting democracy rip. Why is this trending? And it adds credibility to that trend. And then what happens as journalists see this? Journalists on Twitter respond to this. giving legitimacy to this trend. Journalists may try to talk about this topic on Twitter. And it doesn't matter what the topic is. If it's a created trend and journalists talk about it, now that gives credibility to that message. That's how fake news becomes real news. Because now if a journalist covers that topic and it goes into their publication, it doesn't matter what is said in that article. There's a headline that talks about that message, that narrative. Most people read just the headlines now anyway, especially on social media. They don't read the article, they just see the headline. Going back, thinking about that availability heuristic. I saw my friend was talking about this topic. Now all of a sudden, I open up the New York Times. They're talking about this topic. Something in that topic must be true. That's how that works. So if you take your troll network, you have the small core group at the top, you have the large group with strong ties, and then you have a small group of outsiders with weak ties. I was able to map this over time, and what I came up with was something that looks like this. So a little bit about my methodology, because I'm sure that some of you are probably curious about this. So I was never really completely able to identify the entire Russian network. I don't have the tools for that. I'm not part of the intelligence community. This was all academic research, and I had very limited ability to process all this information. But what I did do was I took two accounts that I thought were very specific with their messaging, and I took all of their followers, not who they were following, who their followers were. And I only had the ability to process accounts that were 7,000 or less. So these are two accounts. These are 14,000 total accounts that are compared to each other. And this is what you see. Here in the middle, you have that core group around that bigger ring around the outside. That, I believe, is the bot network. Those are the accounts that are all following these accounts. In the middle here, you have several influential accounts, influencers, if you will. And then around the outside, you have these groups with not quite as strong ties to these groups. My theory was that these outside groups were probably American citizens. Now, there may have been plenty of American citizens. There may have been plenty of American bots there in the center. There were plenty of influencers. So it's really hard to see the dot here. But right in here, there were several American influencers. But you see that those really strong ties existed. And so what I did was I wanted to follow what the network was talking about. What is the big message of the network? And it didn't necessarily matter if it was Republican. It didn't matter if it was Democrat. I didn't care if it was Russian. I wanted to see how this network was moving. If I would have had the technology and the capability, this is what I would have done. I would have wanted the ability to monitor in real time. That's probably not going to work. I would have wanted the ability to monitor in real time this entire network to see what they're talking about. The way that I would do that is I would want to follow all of those accounts and see what the topic is. So down here, there we go. So down here, topic on the x-axis, on the y-axis, time since the last tweet. What I tended to notice was the core of that group as this is also kind of timeline in nature as well. So the latest topic would be right here. As the topics go on, you have those topics. So if people are talking about a topic, it would be at the bottom of the graph. The topics would just move along. What I noticed was you had a lot of these outsiders that were talking about one topic that may have been a little bit older in time. Maybe the newer times had some of these older topics. But as the topics started talking about Russia, Ukraine, Syria, this core group that you see in the middle, they were all talking about this. These outside groups tended not to talk about this. So what I really wanted to focus on was the movement of this group right here. That's how I did that. These were 3 big criteria for me. One of the other things that I would do is I would take a look at the social media profile. I would go profile by profile, and I would click to see what their bio said. One of the common themes to their bio said no lists. They didn't want to be added to any lists. Oftentimes they would say follow back. They would follow people back. And I would take a look at the profile picture that they used. And I would run a Google image search of that. And if that Google image came up with somebody else's picture that could be found on Google, that was probably a troll account. That probably was not that individual tweeting. So if there was somebody who called themselves Deplorable Betty, for example, I would take that picture and I would find somebody who maybe they lived in the United States, maybe they didn't, but after doing a reverse Google image search, I would figure out that's not Betty. But what I did notice was the network gained cohesiveness. After Hillary Clinton said that half of Trump's supporters were normal Americans, patriotic Americans, and half of them you could put them in a basket of deplorables. What she was actually talking about, somewhat ironically, was this group. The group of social media trolls who were out there, who were spreading and fabricating all kinds of lies. That group wore that as a badge of honor. They all changed their name to Deplorable something or other. Deplorable Jim, Deplorable Betty. Interestingly enough, Jermaine, from the very beginning of my story, became Deplorable Lucy. So the person who I actually started my research on became somebody completely different. And this persona solidified the networks. So what I ended up calling this network in my thesis was the Deplorable Network. And without doubt, there were plenty of Americans. There were plenty of patriotic Americans that were part of this network. But a big bulk of it was led by Russian trolls and by Russian bot accounts. And when you take a look at this image that I showed earlier, probably makes a little bit more sense what that cluster is down there in the bottom now. That's the Deplorable Network. You'll also notice, maybe you didn't notice this earlier, there are several networks up here of what appear to be bot accounts as well. So bot accounts existed on both sides in 2016. And I guarantee you, no politician going forward is going to run for national office without having their own bot accounts. They're not going to do it because this was extremely effective. So if you take everything that I've talked about today and put it together, this is on one slide my theory. This is what my thesis ended up boiling down to. Remember, you can't create a narrative without an existing narrative. So if you start up here in the upper left-hand corner, you have a cyber team. In the case of Russians or in the case of ISIS, those are agents who actively try to do things to hack accounts, release emails, create content. They interact with the true believers. The true believers are the people who they are trying to affect, the message that they are trying to insert into their propaganda into. And over here you have the propaganda. And notice the cyber team and the true believers interact. One of the things that I noticed is that a good place for that interaction was on 4chan and 8chan and Reddit. A lot of trends were coordinated on there. And some of those, I believe, were Russian accounts that were coordinating with United States far-right activists who were trying to get things to trend. They did that using hacked emails, forged document, memes, fake news, inserted that into the bot network, and then pumped that out and tried to either create, hijack, or use every trending topic in order to take command of the trend. The reason why I chose Twitter, so I get asked this question, wasn't Facebook used to influence? Yes, I believe that it was. Why did I choose Twitter? Because journalists are on Twitter. And journalists talk about what they're seeing on Twitter. You see it all the time. Journalists talk about the trending topics. And again, when they're talking about that trending topics, it contributes to the trending topics. That then crosses over to the outside network. That alters just a little bit the existing narrative. And that is how I believe fake news can become real news. So why is this important? Hopefully, you've gathered that social media is an effective tool for spreading disinformation. Hopefully you understand that this requires a little bit of understanding of topics like sociology, biology, the way the human mind works, network study, political science, extremist ideology, and of course, warfare and journalism. So I just have a couple of minutes left here. I have a few more slides, and I want to finish it up with this. At the end of Command of the Air, Duhay had a chapter called The War of 19 Dash. He didn't predict what year the war was going to be, but he believed there was going to be another war. So the last chapter of my thesis was called The War of 20X. And in it, my prediction is this. Authoritarian regimes are going to continue to use social media to try to repress the voices of their people. Other foreign governments are going to learn from what Russia did and try to use those tactics. Other terrorist groups or non-government organizations are going to use those tactics. Marketing firms are going to use those tactics. And slander and smear campaigns are going to become the norm. This is an example of one of those. This was spread by a bunch of Russian troll accounts. It had a picture of John McCain meeting with Syrian rebels who are fighting against Assad. This was on a Codel visit to Syria several years ago. But you see here, all of these people are misidentified. That, number 2, is not Baghdadi. But who knows that? Who knows that that's not Baghdadi? If this image says that it is, well, maybe it is. And now you've created an availability heuristic. Now somebody goes back and they think, didn't I see McCain with that? So if you're thinking about that truth spectrum, how can you walk that message off from something that is actually true to something that is not true? And if politicians continue to be victims of this, specifically as it relates to foreign relations, that is going to change United States foreign policy. That's all there is to it. So where do we go from here? At the last minute or so that I have, I would implore each of you to use social media wisely. Don't share things unless you can verify it. Another thing that I think that we need to do as a society is learn from what happened and encourage media literacy. Lateral thinking. Don't get all of your news from one source. If you're getting your news from one source, you're doing yourself a disservice. You need to get different viewpoints in order to understand what your own biases are. And that, I think, is the number one tool that we can use to counter this. The other tool, I believe, it has to be a technology-driven solution. It cannot be a government solution. Because, one, we have a Constitution with the First Amendment. So the government can't repress freedom of speech. Can't do it. Another thing is, would you really want a government to do that, to oversee what people are talking about? To be an arbiter of truth? That's not the government's job. But social media companies, and Mark Zuckerberg right here, they can do something about it, and I believe that they have done something about it, and I believe that they are going to continue to have to do something about this issue. So I'll finish it up with this. Here are a few books that I highly recommend if you're interested in learning more about this. Like War was a book that was just published by P.W. Singer. He talks about a lot of the exact same things that I talk about in this presentation in my paper. I've already talked about True Believer, Thinking Fast and Slow. Big data is a really good look at how companies can use big data, and actually a lot of the big data that's being collected on you. Extremism and Behave. A little bit different topic, right? But again, you have to have an interdisciplinary understanding to understand this. Behave is the biological way that our body creates behavior. Our mind creates behavior. And extremism follows a lot of the same ideas that Behave talks about in Sapolsky's book. But I think that if you read these books, you'll really get an understanding for how I came up with some of the theories that I used and some of the research that I used as well. So I think that we're probably done with the room, but I do want to take the opportunity to open up to questions.
Kicks us out, you can
So far, nobody's kicking us out. But yes, ma'am. Okay.
You saw Jermaine morph into these various characters. How did you know it was the same person? And then secondly, the cosmic question is, do you think the social media networks are doing enough to combat this?
Okay. So for those of you who are watching on the live stream, the first question was, how did I track the people that I identified from the Prey from a Zoo, the one account being Jermaine, and the more cosmic question was, do I think social media companies are doing enough? So to answer the first question, I had notes. I had handwritten notes of the actual handles. So I would go back and do a Twitter search for those handles. So Jermaine was at FanFan1911, and it's burned into my brain because that was actually the account that I engaged with. So I went back and just typed in that account name. And then as I was monitoring several accounts, I would just go back and monitor them occasionally. I did not follow them. I did not create a list of them, although I thought about it. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these accounts in their bios, they would have do not list. Do not put on a list. People you can get a message if you are on somebody's list. And if I would have put them in a list, that would have identified that I'm not following them. I don't want to see what they're saying in their, in their social media feed, in my social media feed. But if I were to put them on a list, I could keep track of this whole network. But what they were doing is they were identifying that people were doing that, and they were blocking accounts that put them on lists. So I did not do that. Instead, I relied on a lot of handwritten notes, and eventually I made an Excel spreadsheet. That's how I developed that chart that you saw earlier. The handle stayed the same.
But the alias changed.
Right. So the alias changed, and the profile picture changed as well. And all of those accounts that I was monitoring, they did. All of them changed. So do I think that social media companies are doing enough? I think that they're doing a lot right now. And I think that they're really struggling with exactly what to do. A lot of people are leaving Facebook in droves because of the privacy concerns and the amount of data that's being collected by Facebook. I know that they have changed the way that they present news stories on Facebook. I know that Twitter is very reactive to controversial trends now. So trends that used to last all day and just be completely hijacked with the most terrible things that you've ever seen, those used to last all day. Now they're removed almost immediately. So Twitter is pretty active with that. But they can't necessarily get rid of all the bot accounts. So the easy solution would be, well, just get rid of all the bot accounts. Well, Twitter uses that as their bottom line, because bot accounts contribute to the total number of people that have accounts. So if Twitter wants to make more money, they have to say, well, we're getting more and more and more accounts. Plus, a lot of the bot accounts that exist online are relatively benign. There are a lot of bot accounts that just tweet daily weather reports, that tweets scores from local teams. So not all bot accounts are bad, but they can't just eliminate entire bot networks. But to answer your question directly, I think that they are doing as much as they can right now. But I think that there's still a lot of room for improvement. Yes, sir.
One of the maxims that I've read in my various history readings is that strategists are always preparing to fight the last war. And so I'm curious if you think that we are prepared, or have we focused so much on what happened in 2016 that we're unprepared for what might happen next year?
Okay, so the question is, strategists often try to fight the last war. Are we preparing for what happened in 2016 for right now?
Are we preparing for 2020 properly? Or are we preparing to thinking that it's going to be like things happened in 2016?
I'm not sure. So as a B-52 guy, I'm outside of that strategy, that planning right now. My guess would be yes, that's probably exactly what's happening. But I can't say for sure because I'm not involved with any of that planning. What I can say is that what the Russians did and what ISIS did will serve as a model. It'll serve as a model to any country who wants to do that, or any non-state group that wants to do that. So it's entirely possible that that may be what happens. But what we are not prepared for, I don't think as a society, is the concept of deep fakes, which is where you can take a video or even a still photo and add a voice to it that makes it seem like that person is actually doing the talking. I think that is going to be a game changer. Artificial intelligence is going to be a game changer. And as social media companies develop artificial intelligence to find unsavory trends, unsavory topics on their platforms, the adversary is going to do the exact same thing. They're going to create AI that somehow figures out a way around this. So I think AI and deep fakes are going to be the next big thing. There's already software that exists that can identify whether something is real or fake. But to the average person in here, we're probably not going to be able to identify that. I recommend you look up a video online. There's a video of Jordan Peele, who talks over Barack Obama. And Obama is talking, and his mouth is moving, and it looks exactly like Obama is giving this speech, but it's not. It's Jordan Peele. And you can, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an impersonator who's doing the voice. You can actually take enough clips of somebody's voice. You can modulate that to change what they're actually saying. So I could be in front of a camera, I could be speaking, and I could be talking as if I were President Trump right now. And the modulation would sound exactly like him, and his face would be moving exactly the same way that I'm moving my mouth right now, or the exact way that he would move his mouth with those words. So deep fakes is something that I don't think we're ready for as a society. And I would anticipate that we will see something like this in 2020 with deep fakes and with a lot of AI as well. Because AI can take the human out of the loop. The human doesn't have to control the messaging anymore. AI can take the pulse of all of the social media content, all of the big data that exists on social media, and start messaging directly to individuals that can slowly walk them off the message. The trend may not be the big factor in 2020. Precision targeted messaging, I think, will be because of AI. Yes, sir.
You said that journalists help legitimize some of the bots and fake information. So do you think media outlets are doing enough to combat these fake news?
Thank you. So the question was that journalists can legitimize some of these fake accounts, some of these bot accounts. So are media outlets doing enough? I don't know. It seems like they are, but at the same time, journalists, you're under a deadline, right? You have to get the story, and it behooves you to get the story first. And not only to get the story first, but to talk about the story first and to build your own brand on social media. And if you're doing that, the temptation is too great for an individual journalist. I don't know exactly how media outlets are handling that, how news organizations are handling that. I know that I have a friend who's a reporter for National Public Radio, and she shared with me that National Public Radio, NPR, has rules for basically guidelines for how to use social media, kind of gives a left and right boundary for how they're to operate. But at the same time, they're encouraged to use it. They're encouraged to use it to promote their own stories, to promote their own brand, and to communicate with people. So I'm not sure exactly how news organizations are going to deal with that, but it's definitely a problem that journalists are going to continue to have, because, like I said, journalists, they have to be there. They have to talk about about topics that need to be discussed. Thank you.
Any other question?
Yes, sir.
Besides the reverse Google image search, what other techniques journalists can use to identify this dynamic?
Okay, so like I said here, so I did not have the technology to be able to graph tweets in real time to find out exactly what the networks were talking about. What I did discover was that of the 14,000 accounts that I had, a large chunk of them would move in sync with one another. And it was very much coordinated with exactly what the Russian Foreign Ministry was putting out, with a narrative that the Russian government that was very, very pro-Russia, and with what RT was putting out there as well. So news topics that were popular on RT, I don't know which came first, whether it was the trend moving RT that way, or whether RT was started the story and they followed the story. But it seemed to me almost that they were happening at the same time. So when I saw these three things, I would flag that user as possibly being Russian. Because the fact is, not a lot of Americans were talking about these things. Specifically the pro-Russia stuff. I remember one tweet specifically that had, it was deplorable Becky or something like that. And she had pro-Trump tweet, pro-Trump tweet, pro-Trump tweet. And then Russian Duma passes a pro-feminist law. Victory for feminism and the Russian people. And I thought, well, first of all, the political messaging doesn't quite line up. And second of all, why is this person talking about what the Russian parliament is what laws they're passing? And then I noticed several other pieces of Russian propaganda, and it was just Russian propaganda. Specifically, the white helmets were very, very easy to target, because if you remember back to the image slide that I had, if they could take that image and try to warp it as the white helmets are part of a terrorist organization, you could also translate that message in that same image as what Russia is doing in Syria is good and the right thing. So it all followed the same narrative of pro-Russian propaganda. And was it effective? I think that it was. So there was a Gallup poll in 2015 that got Americans' favorability of Vladimir Putin. And it was relatively low in 2015. That was after the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula, but before the 2016 campaign. It was pretty low. After 2016 and 2017, Gallup ran the exact same poll, and he had higher favorability ratings across the board, specifically with Republican voters, which is extremely surprising. Vladimir Putin got a 20-point boost from Republican voters, which was exactly the voters that network was targeting. And why? I don't know. Like I said, I think that availability heuristic played a lot to do with that. And if you see enough information, if the noise level just keeps rising, eventually some of that starts to set in. And so if you see enough things in your Twitter feed that says Russia is good, Russia is good, Russia is good, and it's a source and a network that you believe and trust, then maybe that you start to believe and trust that as well. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Lotus.
Thank you.
You mentioned that Facebook users are disappearing. Is that the same true of Twitter? Is that disappearing as well? Or is that NPR piece the other day about I'm on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Twitter?
I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that as much about Twitter. What I do know is that all of this happened on Twitter, and Twitter is one of the lesser used social media platforms in the first place. Again, the reason why I chose Twitter as my topic was because I believe that trends function is kind of an equalizing factor. And the other reason is because journalists are on Twitter. So a lot of journalists love Twitter. A lot of academics love Twitter. I love Twitter for baseball. I love talking about baseball and dog pictures on Twitter. I think that's probably the best part of social media is dog pictures. But dog and cat pictures, of course. I have not heard that's happening with Twitter quite as much. But it's interesting because a lot of the people in my squadron in the Air Force are 20-somethings, mid-20s, and a lot of them have quit Facebook lately. I would say, just speculating, I would say that probably half of them have deleted their Facebook accounts, most of them within the last year. So young people tend to be deleting their Facebook accounts. Right.
And so I think some people just have another 5 years to go before they really get tired of it. And I think we'll all get tired.
I think so too. In fact, Clyde and I were talking about this last night. I'm concerned that this is going to be a factor in 2020. I believe that AI and deepfakes are going to be an issue. I think that something very similar with trying to command the trend is going to be a factor, although social media is trying to, really specifically Twitter is trying to stop those trends before they even start. But what I told Clyde last night was, I don't think social media is going to necessarily be around that much longer. And I know that that sounds really, really strange to stand here today in February of 2019 and say that. But I just think that the next big thing is going to happen, and people are going to forget about social media as we know it. So if you remember back to the early 2000s, everybody had a MySpace account. And then everybody abandoned MySpace and went to Facebook, and now they're Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. There are all kinds of things. These platforms, they come and they go, they gain and they lose popularity. So something like social media, something where people can still keep in touch with their group of friends and get information, because a lot of people are just using social media to get information. Something is going to replace it. I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's going to necessarily look like Facebook. So I think if I were to give this lecture 5 years from now, it's going to be a historical lecture. Like, hey, do you guys remember Twitter? I really truly believe that at some point our interest in this is as a society is going to change. It's going to wane.
Things that are coming up, do you think Instagram, like I don't know a lot about the picture sharing, Instagram and Snapchat and all that. Is it replaceable? Are these hackers going to be, and the bots going to be able to do the same thing in these other programs if it is that Snapchat's the next Facebook? Or is it possible in all those programs to do what they're doing?
Yes and no. So what I specifically focused on with Twitter was the trend function. Facebook, I think, still has a trend function. I'm not sure. They did for a little while. I'm not sure if it even exists anymore. It was never really popular on Facebook. But that was how, on Twitter, a message would hop from one network to the other. Because otherwise, people would just sit around in their own little echo chamber and talk about this fake news, and it would never get out. But the trend function was the bridge to the other side, to the other network, to the public writ large. I don't think Instagram has that. Instagram has hashtags that you can click on, so you can see all of the things that are associated with that particular hashtag, the same way that Twitter does, but I'm pretty sure that they don't have a trend function. But that's why I believe that the next evolution of this social media attack as a national security issue is going to be precision messaging. It's going to be somebody who looks and seems a lot like your friend, that then starts sending you direct messaging or ads that are specifically targeted towards you. And that's what happened. That was one of the things that happened with Facebook, was precision targeted ads based on big data. If person X liked these certain things, they fit into a criteria, specifically if they lived in a certain place, if they met the demographic criteria, they would see something in their feed that would be an ad that would, as they're scrolling along or flipping along on their phone, they would see something that would appear that looked like, I mean, it was an ad, but it looked like something from their friends, because in your feed, it just all kind of looks the same. I think that's probably, if I had to guess right now, that's probably going to be the next big thing, because the trend isn't going to quite be an issue as much anymore. Yes, sir.
Two related questions, both about offensive measures, and I'll be quick since I'm asking for two. One is regarding the personal computer. Have you seen or heard of any, you mentioned software that might be able to combat AI? Specifically, do you see a future, have you heard anything about software that would be available to consumers to download to our PCs and our phones that would allow us for, $39.99 a year to be able to investigate in a second or two IPs, where they're from, who they are, what their history are? And the second question is maybe for the journalists. When I think about defensive measures and what might be possible, we know that NSA, FBI, military are tracking sources of fake news, bots, and trolls around the world so that they can know who they are and identify them when they see them. In the same way that the FBI and the Southern Poverty Law Center a private organization, tracks hate groups in the United States, and that's their mission, that's their dedication. Is there any indication that there's a consortium of media outlets and journalists in this country who are putting money and resources together to form a version of the SPLC to identify and track and continuously monitor sources of fake news so that the editorial room can go there and check on something that's on Twitter first before they start carrying it?
So I'll answer your first question, or your second question first. So the question was, your first question was, is there anything commercially available for you to put on your phone or your laptop to monitor what's going on? The second one is there any private organization that's trying to identify these networks the same way that the Southern Poverty Law Center identifies hate groups? The answer to your second question is I believe that there are some private organizations that are trying to do that right now. Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, started a project recently where he's trying to create a site that validates and verifies news, trending topics, things available on social media. That is also being done by some social media companies right now. They're experimenting with some things that can kind of have true false flags, or something that says this message was paid for by this company, so for Facebook ads. There's also some apps that you can install. I'm not really very familiar with them, but there are certain apps that you can install as add-ons to your Facebook account. I don't necessarily trust them though, because anytime you're adding anything that allows an app to see your profile, you're giving away information. Excuse me. So I don't necessarily trust those things, but I think that there will be more of those available in the future for the consumer to be able to add onto their phone as an app that will kind of verify that news. Excuse me.
Any other questions? Kind of worn through our hour quickly here. I just want to say that me, thanks for this, and I hope that in the future that we as journalists take this forward next time. Maybe some of the tools you give us will help. Let's give our guests a big hand. And go out to the Boone County Historical Society and see our great exhibit on fake news. We've been running for at least a couple months.